see. Okay, so we're going to come back to Trump and David, all right? Because I was looking at some of the comments before we went live, and this there was a whole lot of people reminding me of David's great sin, right? And reminding me that, another reason why you can't really say Trump is the modern day David is because when David messed up, he was heartbroken over it. He repented over it. He was contrite. Okay, I recognize it, right? Nathan comes up to him and says, "You've sinned," and David says, "Oh no, I've sinned, and I know I've sinned." And he rips his clothes, and he's very aware of his sin. But it's not necessarily. But that moment, okay, that whole episode for David actually shows us of a time when there is something that Donald Trump and David have in common. Now, I know you're going to say, "Oh, yes, it's adultery." Well, sure. But it wasn't adultery for David. He was the king. He had many wives, taking another one. Oh, by the way, the story we're talking about obviously is Bathsheba, right? The sin for David wasn't adultery. Murder came later to protect the news of a pregnancy. He didn't want to get in trouble for sleeping with another man's wife. But anyhow, when David goes up to the top of the palace, and he looks out over his city, and he sees on the roof of another home a woman bathing, and he thinks she's so beautiful, and he says, "Bring her over for supper. I want to have her here for supper." And who is she? "Oh, that's Uriah's wife, one of your generals. So bring her here. I'm gonna spend the night with her." And sure enough, they have supper, and he ends up sleeping with her. Now, there's also a whole lot to be considered here about power dynamic, and that's really kind of what this is about. Okay, there's a massive power dynamic here. She's Uriah's wife. He's the king. She's going to do what he tells her to do. And she ends up becoming pregnant after spending the night with David. Now, this episode, it isn't just faulty judgment on David's part. That's definitely there. It's definitely a piece of it. But it's also just really, really, really poor impulse control. He shows zero self-control in this moment. He shows zero self-control. He sees something that he wants, and he takes it, right? He sees a beautiful woman, and he has to have her, despite the fact that he has a palace full of women. He has a country where he could go out and with an edict say, "Send me all your most beautiful women that I may marry them all." And he could do that. No. In this moment, he looks out and he sees this woman, beautiful woman, and he can't control himself. And he takes her. And he does it because he can. Ultimately, he does it because he can. He misuses the power that's been given to him because, and this is me thinking, it's just an opinion, I think, but David forgot that he was a man after God's own heart. He forgot about God's place in his life. David began to believe the legend that he had become. He began believing that he was this man that all the people around him told him he was. He began believing that he was this warrior, this king, this divine being that all the people in the city, all the people of Israel proclaimed him to be. And then he decided to take what wasn't his simply because he wanted it. What does this have to do with Trump? Well, think about some of the ways that he's gotten in trouble. Like brags, and these aren't just things that you hear in the news. Oh, it's not true. These are things that he's bragged about. Well, you can walk right up to them and grab them in the most intimate of places. He uses a different word. You can grab them right there, and they'll let you because you're famous. Because you're powerful. Because you're someone who matters. Right? You can, what was it on the Howard Stern show? I think it was Howard Stern. Don't quote me on that. But he bragged. He bragged about walking into the changing rooms at his beauty pageants. Now I can just walk right in and look around and make sure. Who does these kinds of things? Right? Who does these kinds of things? Person that can. Person of power, person of prestige, a person of wealth, a person of some authority in that moment. You can walk into the dressing room of a bunch of women being changed because I own this pageant. I can do that. You can't stop me from doing that. That's a person who wants to do something and is willing to do it because they can. No self-control. No impulse control at all. It's someone who misuses his power, misuses his wealth, misuses the status that he's gained. So, when we say, well, he's not the modern day Trump, there are valid comparisons that you can make between Trump and David. Somebody else commented that, David danced in the rain. Well, I don't know. Maybe Trump likes to dance in the rain, and we can make that dance naked in the rain, and we can make that comparison as well. But in this case, this is a valid comparison. These two men, at least at some points in their lives, have shown no willpower. And they've used their status, they've used their power to take what they want from other people, regardless of what it was going to make those other people, how it was going to make those other people feel. In the case with Bathsheba, not only does she end up being unfaithful to her husband, again, probably because of the power dynamic. She can't say no. Her husband ends up murdered because David's scared that he's going to lose. David is scared he's going to lose the prestige that his people see him, how his people see him. It's odd. It's not odd. It makes a lot of sense. Most of the world's major religions and the philosophies that have held on, most of them. I mean, as a matter of fact, I can't think of one that says the opposite. They all call self-control as a virtue. In the Christian world, in the New Testament, self-control is seen as one of the fruits of the Spirit. One of the things one of the virtues of a mature Christian is self-control and discipline. Godly people of faith are all challenged to practice the discipline of not using their status and their power and their authority and their wealth to get the things that they want, but rather to let that go. To not abuse that gift that you've been given for self-centered, selfish reasons. I mean, we all see things that we want, and all of us, in some respect, have an ability to take what we want. But from the time of being a small kid, we're all told not to. It's not okay. And as, the farther up that social ladder we climb, the more self-control matters. The more impulse control matters. The more disciplining ourselves, practicing, not using our status to get and to take what we want, the more important it becomes. Now, I know that Ben Carson, calling Trump a man after God's own heart, I know he wasn't talking about the Bathsheba moment. And I know those pastors out there that are writing blogs and giving sermons about how he's the modern day David. I know they're not talking about this moment. I know this isn't the comparison they're making when they say, oh yeah, and Trump, yeah, Trump's just like David. He has no self-control. No, they're not talking at all about that stuff. They might not be talking anything beyond Goliath, right? David facing off against Goliath. They might not be talking about anything more than David being chosen by God to be the next king of Israel, that's Saul's successor. They might not be talking about anything beyond that. I know they're not. Because all they're really doing is they're trying to sell us on why we should throw our support behind this guy. But, when you make comparisons, you got to be really careful. You got to be really, really careful when you make comparisons like this. And maybe this is just God's sense of humor, right? Like, oh yeah, you go ahead and make that comparison. Maybe there's a spirit of confusion that came upon these people and said, I don't want you to remember that other thing. I don't want you to remember how David's sin led to the destruction of his family, led to his broken heart. How David's sin led to the death of a child, how David's sin ultimately led to his children, his adult children, abusing each other and turning on one another. How it led to civil war. Right? They don't want us to think about those comparisons. Just stop at the king thing. Don't get into the Bathsheba thing. Don't get into the Uriah thing. Don't get into the impulse control thing. Don't get into actually David's sin began when David began seeing himself as a great man. David's sin began when he began to believe the myth of his own legend. When he began seeing himself as someone that has all the power. Perhaps David even began thinking he didn't need God in these moments. He'd achieved everything. He had everything that he needed at his fingertips. He didn't need to count on God like he did when he was a boy. Donald Trump is the modern day David. Well, when it comes to how he and David both have zero impulse control and are willing to abuse the people around them, willing to take from the people around them the things that they want, when they're willing to use their power and their status and their wealth and how the world perceives them for their own selfish reasons, maybe Trump is the modern day David. Amen.